All right, folks. Thanks for coming. All right, I'm going to kick off. Hopefully, we have enough time for lots of questions. So I'll try to get through this quickly because I think questions are really interesting, and people's specific cases are probably more interesting. That's very cool. We're good. Okay. Okay. Anyways, you remember this from the morning. Hopefully, you were there. Essentially, we really want to use flow engineering to take a team that is doing work and make sure that they are doing more of the right type of work, and unblocking the things that hold them back from doing the right things more effectively and efficiently. A very early case of applying this in my professional career was I first started consulting with a company that approached me because what they were looking for was a big picture view that would help them justify an investment in a piece of their process. So they had a critical stage in their SDLC. Artifact deployment was very hot at the time. It was very, let's say, meaningful focal point for a lot of teams. How do we get code to test environments, to staging environments, to production? And this is a very big company, big budgets, and they said, we want to make a case for $20 million to invest in deployment automation. And they came to me because they were like, we need to make a case to the board to do this. And so I accepted the challenge. What we did was basically map out the entire value stream to put that in context and say, justify this idea that this was holding them back from delivering more often and getting faster feedback and having higher throughput and getting more results for the business. And what happened was we mapped out this entire value stream, and it turned out that we had different areas that were more consequential than simply deployment. Like, they didn't like the fact that there was a manual process where they had to ping somebody on Slack and ask them to deploy something, and somebody would type in some command. But it turns out that that was actually a small piece of the puzzle. And even though it was like interruptive and manual, it could be easily automated without some like complicated tool. We didn't need $20 million. And we actually found two other areas that were way more consequential than this one piece of the pipeline where we assumed there was a lot of opportunity, right? We heard a lot of complaints from developers. We heard, out in the market, there's a lot of people talking about this tool and this set of tooling. And everyone was really excited about all these things that you could do with deployment automation. So that's where all the attention went. And meanwhile, there was this upstream opportunity and a downstream opportunity that were way more consequential. They took up way more time in the overall flow of the value stream. And so one of the things that I took away from this also was I was talking to one of the project managers there. He'd been there for 19 years. And the thing he said after we mapped out the value stream was, this is the first time I've ever seen our process start to finish. They'd been living in this world where there's a bunch of things happening in tools, there's a bunch of activity happening in teams, but there was no big picture of how it all fit together and actually delivered results or came together to create this holistic end-to-end picture of how we actually work in this organization. So this was very valuable use of a couple hours at a time. This didn't take a long time to do. And it really brought together this group of people who had very different perspectives, very different assumptions. And all of a sudden we're on the same page and we're talking about these kind of measurable, meaningful focal points in the process. So why does this matter to AI? Why does this matter today? When we can automate so many things and it's so easy to instrument and measure things. is that we make assumptions about where we should be implementing AI, right? We all think that AI should be focused on development. We think it can be focused on design and upfront requirements gathering or definition or planning. Where we think we should be applying solutions is one thing, but what the data shows us and what our actual flow is demanding, or where we are actually constrained is really what matters. So we can accelerate where we think we have an opportunity. We can implement all kinds of tooling and automation, and we can bury other aspects of the value stream that are blocked from moving that work forwards, right? So if we're accelerating upstream, has anybody ever seen a clip of I Love Lucy where she gets a job at a chocolate factory? It's hilarious because, you know, obviously there's this, like, she's sitting on an assembly line and like she has to inspect chocolates, and at some point she just starts getting overloaded, and instead of like stopping the line, she's eating chocolates, like frantically trying to keep up with this flow that's you know, not engineered for continuous delivery, right? So the problem with this is not only are we overloading people who can't move any faster when we accelerate something that doesn't have an opportunity to flow through the later stages of a process, it's that we're also starving things that are downstream, right? Every time we are downstream of a constraint, there's not enough work to actually fulfill that demand as well. So we need to have this flow. We're always going to have a constraint, but we need to be very conscious of where these constraints are, because that's where the automation opportunity is. That's where the return on investment is. And ultimately, what matters is that somebody's waiting for the output, the outcome. And the more we have this like situation where work is piling up ahead of a constraint or a bottleneck, you know, ultimately we're not serving the purpose of these value streams and these processes, right? We really need to make sure that everything that we're implementing is actually serving a business outcome, something that benefits customers. And so, like, having a view over where we are constrained is really important if we're thinking about where should we be deploying capabilities, where should we be investing. Okay, there's a lot of statistics. I'm not going to get into like a lot of statistics. We've heard them all by now. I do think that you know, as we look out over a landscape of technology and business, we want to be funding those investments and making those cases for investments in the areas where we can really strongly attribute a potential return on investment, right? We have some data to support a hypothesis. We have some visualization, hopefully, that we can bring to an executive and say, I know you have 50 things that you're paying attention to. Here's a picture, and I'm going to point to the place on the picture where I want you to pay attention, and let's have a discussion about whether we can agree that investing in this area is a good idea, right? And so if we have a visualization and data to support that, I think we have way better conversations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So flow engineering is basically a label that I've put on a process that I use to do this job of figuring out where should we focus, how should we focus, and how are we actually going to act on our opportunities. And it is ultimately in service of enabling flow, enabling continuous delivery, higher throughput, getting more of the right things done. But ultimately, the way that we do that is create clarity across a large surface area that matters to getting things done. We want enough visibility that we understand the big picture and the context of what's happening. And then to do that well, we have to have a strong understanding of what's really important, right? Because what's really important is the difference between being distracted by a lot of things or being overwhelmed by so many things that we have to pay attention to, and being able to sort of really zero in on what's most important and not ignore everything else, but have a very clear priority of this matters more than this other thing. So the way that this works from a high level is we start with what I call outcome mapping. It's a very specific technique that kind of borrows from different ways that we zero in on what are we really trying to do. It's kind of a lean method to do that identification of value, that clarification of what are we trying to do so we don't have to pay attention to everything. And then we look at value streams as a way of understanding how are things happening today. How do we create that visibility into the current state? And dependency mapping is kind of the second half of that, where we dig deep into the areas that emerge as like problematic or extremely interesting, let's say. So as we map a value stream, the places where most of the time is being spent, where we hear a lot of conversation about toil or friction or delay, we can dig in and find out what is holding those areas back. What are the dependencies that require us to wait or queue or go look for information that should be available? All these things I consider as dependencies from a process perspective. And then future state design is really about how do we redesign what we're doing to improve performance? How do we get to a better state that delivers on our target outcome? And the roadmap is really a very specific way of just lining up everything that we aim to do to improve the system of work. And I'll give you examples of all this, but the starting point is really kind of gathering the people who are going to do this work. The question always comes up, who's going to do this? And I think that it's really important to have an executive sponsor who's connected to some kind of business outcome or a consequential outcome. It's really helpful to have a facilitator, so someone who can run a meeting, someone who can run a board game. People who are into board games are great facilitators. If you have a dungeon master in your team, they're a great facilitator. I am not a great dungeon master, but I can appreciate that skill set. And then you have representation from across the value stream, right? So what are the different groups that are involved in handoffs? What are the capabilities and skills that are represented in getting that work from plan to delivered and enabled in production? And we want the fullest representation of this as possible, because our constraint could be anywhere along that flow. And if we're looking at a narrow slice, we're liable to miss it, right? We're liable to focus on something that isn't actually the overall constraint. We can inform that with a lot of data. I mean, we could always survey a team and say, where do we think the biggest problem is? But as I mentioned earlier, this is not always correct, right? Our intuitions about where we're actually blocked is highly biased, and it's very much narrowed in our understanding of an overall system, which is very incomplete most of the time. So the very intentional zoom out to capture the broadest possible scope is really helpful. Okay, outcome mapping. Outcome mapping kind of emerged after I was doing value stream mapping for a while, because I found it was very difficult to just dive in and understand what was important to map and what was not important to map, or what information was really critical for us to capture, what scope, what level of detail. All these things were really challenging to understand if we just dove right into mapping. And so outcome mapping is a initial step where we try to understand what is it that we're really trying to do. And this is a common outcome in flow engineering, accelerating throughput generally, but we can use anything like improving quality, reducing production defects, getting faster feedback, experimenting more often. There's a lot of different things that you could choose as a target outcome. Sometimes it's, we have a new hire and we want to onboard that hire to understand the system of work because they're in charge of improving it. So we might actually go through this entire effort just for the purposes of education. So in addition to the outcome, we want to understand why are we doing this? Because sometimes the goal makes sense to one or two people on the team, but not necessarily everybody. Certainly people can be unclear about what's in it for me? What does this have to do with all the OKRs that we have, or all the other things that we're measuring or trying to do? So benefits is an opportunity to kind of clarify that. Obstacles is an opportunity for us to surface things that we might run into or trip over or block us or hold us back. And then next steps is another opportunity to say, what can we do in pursuit of the target outcome that may or may not be the next steps of flow engineering? So flow engineering is like a pretty stable program, but we can also branch it into interviews, we can branch it into experiments, prototyping, surveying people. There's a lot of different things that you could do as next steps. And I want all of these mapping exercises to be kind of like modular in that if you wanted to just run outcome mapping, you could just run outcome mapping. If it seemed like people weren't on the same page about what we're trying to do, or we're unclear, or maybe it's early in the year and we're doing goal setting, maybe we're crafting OKRs. So outcome mapping could be used for that purpose to really get us clear on what are we trying to accomplish. So, and one thing that I skipped getting to this is the idea of outcome discovery. So as an input to this, we generally will do like a broad, expansive data collection from the team across a number of different categories. We'll talk about pains, goals, questions, ideas, and then general context, just to get a brain dump from everybody. And then we'll do affinity mapping, and then we'll zero in on what is the target outcome. So if you don't know what the target outcome is, that's how we get to that. We sort of distill it down from a bunch of raw material. So the value stream mapping, one thing that you're probably going to run into really quickly is this idea of how do we pick a value stream? What is a value stream in a lot of organizations, right? It's not explicitly defined. They kind of exist in some form or another. I find that a really helpful way is to kind of work backwards from what value is being delivered. There's a customer involved. It could be an internal customer, an external customer. And then how does that actually happen? And work backwards from the delivery of value. And that kind of reveals the value stream in whatever form it exists. It could be totally informal and wind through the whole organization, or it could be the streamlined bullet train and anything in between. In terms of what these look like in organizations, they can be any type of process that really delivers value to customers, whether those customers are inside the business or outside the business. So some of the value streams that I've worked through in the past are things like hiring people, onboarding hires, onboarding partners, doing mergers and acquisitions. There's a lot of different things. You can do sales processes, marketing, campaign development, event planning. All of these things are, flows of activity with clear start points, clear end points, and performance and throughput matter, right? The amount that we're able to get done is really consequential. So the way that this works is, again, we work backwards for a couple of reasons. One, it's easier to remember things when we work backwards. It's easier to make sure that we're tracing like a clear path if we work backwards and ask the question, okay, what happens to make that possible and what happens to make that possible? It prevents us from kind of branching out into things that are ultimately not involved in the outcome of the value stream. Because things can branch out into all kinds of different areas, and we don't always have time. I mean, we never have time to really explore everything. There's two assumptions that I operate under with flow engineering. One is that nobody cares, so we have to make people care. We have to make it valuable to people. And the second one is nobody has time. So all this is meant to be valuable. So every session delivers some value. Demonstrable value, like value that we can actually see. There's an artifact, there's something that we actually produce that didn't exist before. And then the other thing is that it's all quick and relatively quick. So we aim to do these mapping exercises in 2 hours or less. The I would say the Goldilocks zone is like 90 minutes, but usually that's only in an organization where they've done something like this before. Your first time, you're probably hitting 2 hours easily, but we don't want to spend more than 2 hours on this because people are sharp at 2 hours. They get really low energy and you start to really compromise after that point. So we want this to be really sharp, minimal, simple. And the way that we do that is we can always dive deeper, right? So we can start very high level, and where we see opportunities for more detail or a desire for more detail, we can go deeper, but we don't go deeper without having that curiosity to kind of fuel it, right? So that value aspect is kind of woven into all of this, where we map a bit, we see what emerges, and if that's interesting, we go deeper. But if not, we just move on, right? We don't want to be dragging people through this process. So we lay out the stages of the process, we add these measurements. On the top, you have cycle time, so how long did it take to do this activity? And then below, you have the delay, which is how long passes between activities, between the handoff. And the way we get these measurements is, ideally, we're talking about a very specific case. We're talking about the last iteration, the last project, or the last feature that went out. But we can also talk about aggregates. So we could talk about what is typical. What's a typical flow of a story through the sprint process, for instance, or the Kanban process, or the product development process. So that reveals data that stands out, like that will provide us with something that is notable relative to all the other data in the flow, right? So we have measurements for all these things. Obviously, 3 weeks is way more than the rest of the timing. We could say that based on the time that's spent before planning and then after planning, that all of it is kind of a problem area that we are interested in. Let's find out more about what's happening in planning, because it seems like it's taking a long time relative to the rest of the value stream. Obviously, there's other areas that we could dig deeper into, but this one is the most consequential. It's taking up the most time. And so we don't have to care about everything. We're going to dig deeper there because we have some, I like to talk about the idea that where we see, some gold, we dig for more gold, right? So if we see gold dust, we dig for gold nuggets. If we see gold nuggets, we might have a vein. If we have vein, we might have a deposit. And, if we get that far, we build a gold mine, right? And we really capitalize. But we don't just strip mine the entire, the entire landscape looking for everything. Because nobody cares, nobody has time. So we can use this to understand what is lead time. This is an indication of lead time. It doesn't have to be perfect, doesn't have to be precise. The only thing that matters is that we have a focal point that has some data behind it that we can chase with with high confidence that we have something of value to pursue. And then the wait time we can understand as a ratio of the lead time. Often these are actually reversed. So you usually have way more wait time than you do actually active time in the value stream, especially if there's a lot of handoffs. This is what a value stream map could look like. This is actually an extreme amount of detail relative to most of the maps that I produce. We don't usually get into tools and artifacts, but we can. We can talk about information flow. So how does information get passed from stage to stage? The arrows that you see are rework. And oftentimes we'll represent rework as a percentage. So 50% of the time it gets sent back. We find something in review and it gets sent back. Not every time, but 50% of the time, 60% of the time. We can represent different roles to understand handoffs more clearly. Sometimes this really surfaces some valuable information about, we hand it off and then we hand it back, and it could just go all the way through. There's no reason to kind of have two parties involved and context loss and context switching and all this stuff. Okay, and in here, again, we have a hotspot. We have something to focus on. This is a more representative, typical value stream, a little bit more complex. This is in a large bank. Very complicated process. Obviously, very long, lots of handoffs, multiple hotspots, but of course we can rank these things. We can say this one has way more time than this one. What I also consider when I'm thinking about hotspots is the upstream versus downstream. If I have a hotspot upstream, I'm going to focus more on that, all things being equal, than downstream, because garbage in, garbage out, right? If I can improve upstream, there's much more likelihood that I have quality flowing downstream and I have less problems downstream. So I will tend to focus more on upstream concerns. So you can see a couple different things that are a little bit different here. The profiling of the types of activities. This is really because we wanted a high degree of detail, but you can see like we broke down each activity by type, so we could see like relative proportions of types of activities that are happening. Different types could be value added versus non-value added time. That's kind of a touchy subject because value, we don't want to talk about people contributing as valuable or not valuable. It's all valuable in some context. But what we do care about in the context of a value stream is, does a customer consider this valuable? Would they pay for this? Or if they didn't get this, would it change their perception of value? Because a lot of things that we do for the company's sake does not actually benefit the customer. And it's fine, we can do that, but that should be like a deliberate, intentional investment, right? So what happens between before and after is we have a much shorter process where we've optimized a lot of the low-hanging fruit out of the way. We've pulled some non-value added activities out in parallel. Those are those parallel streams that you see. And there's like a bunch of different factors that have been kind of delivered by this result. So we're eliminating waste. We're getting faster delivery of results. We're also getting faster feedback. So going from 64 weeks to 32 weeks, obviously we're delivering value faster. Doesn't mean we're delivering all of the same quantity, but we're getting much faster feedback and we are able to pivot if we're off track. So we typically will find we're delivering more work than ever in less time. But even if we were delivering the same amount of work or less, we're getting feedback faster. We're getting validation that we're on the right track faster. That's extremely valuable. And as a result of these mapping exercises, you have more unity across all these participants in the value stream who now understand my piece versus someone else's piece, how we're all part of the same flow. There's kind of these side benefits here. One thing I want to touch on is this idea of like, okay, I have 200 teams. Am I going to map every single one of my teams? I have all these processes in my organization. Are we going to map all of them? It would be great if you could do that. Again, no one cares, no one has time. What do we do? Often what will happen is that we map a couple of streams and we find common challenges and we go tackle the common challenges and all of a sudden all the streams are improved, right? There's a lot of opportunity for CI/CD pipelines, big common bottleneck, environment stability and availability, upstream planning and shaping. All these things are very, very common. Testing, manual testing, huge common problem. These are kind of predictable, but of course, the fact that they're predictable doesn't mean that we can just go chase them. Often we have to have some data or some clarity on what is the real problem here and how much should we be investing in fixing this? What's the value of fixing it? To what extent should we be investing? So the value stream mapping gives us that. Having a couple of streams gives us more evidence, more concrete evidence that this is something potentially systemic, likely systemic, that establishes this case for return on investment, which I think is really helpful. Another thing that I really like about this is that we have these traditional sides of a business, right? You have the tech side and the business side. They don't understand each other. They don't eat lunch together. Sometimes they don't like each other. But the map provides them an opportunity to kind of look at the same thing and at least have a productive conversation about what are we actually talking about here. So on the business side, there's an opportunity, I would say a better opportunity, to kind of convey the needs of the tech side of the business and vice versa. They can have this dialogue about what's important to me, what's important to you, what are you trying to do, what are you trying to do, and where are we both impacted by this problematic area of the flow. So dependency mapping is really where we kind of dig in. As I mentioned, we don't map everything in detail. If we were to map every dependency, that would be a total waste of time. It'd be very complete but very low value relative to focusing on the areas that are the most problematic. So we take that hotspot and we dig in and find out, okay, what's really happening there. If we map that into the kind of the sub-process level and understand what are the activities that are happening in that stage, then we get a higher degree of detail. We get more clarity on what's happening. We can go into detail with that. We can do the same cycle time calculations and wait time calculations. But we can also just say, which of these areas are the most challenging or problematic or manual or annoying, and use the information from the team that way, right? That's an option we always have. We don't need data for everything. People know, especially at higher levels of detail, they're very familiar with what's happening, and we can get clarity that way. Again, if you have time, if you have appetite for those things, if there's demand, you can always spend more time. But what we will do is even dig deeper into these conditions that we see in the sub-process and ask, why are these things happening, right? We do a 5 whys exercise and just ask why until we're exhausted. That's not how it goes, but you dig deeper and deeper into what might be causing this. But we can also just look at causal factors. What are the things that are influencing this area of challenge? So that all feeds into our future state, which is essentially where we start to get into the solution space. We've spent all this time in the problem space. How do we understand with high degree of clarity and confidence what's happening, what's holding us back? And future state mapping is really where we start to talk about what are we going to do about it. So we'll take our value stream and the dependency representation of detail, and we can attribute these ideas and questions, these potential interventions, to very specific areas that we've highlighted as our hotspots, as our areas of challenge. So this can give us an understanding of what are we actually going to do about this? What could we do about this? And again, this is an opportunity for the team to be very creative, to exercise their problem-solving skills, to be empowered to own these problems and own the solutions. And again, we're not just diving into solutions, right? We've deeply understood the problems, so our solutions are way more appropriate, right? We can connect them very clearly to why do we want to do this? What is the relative return on investment that we expect from these things? Because we can't do everything, right? We're going to come out of this with a bunch of different things that we could do, and we need to find a way of sort of deciding what is going to give us the biggest bang for the buck, essentially. That's where the flow road mapping starts, is when we have a list of possible interventions, we will plot them out onto a canvas that allows us to kind of filter for the most high impact, high feasibility things. So what would be essentially the most consequential things that would be the easiest to accomplish? And they kind of go all the way up into that top right corner. It's top right for you guys too. The way we do this is we do these dimensions one at a time. So we'll actually kind of take all of the items and stack them up in terms of importance, and then we drag them across to get feasibility. So we'll do one at a time, and the whole team basically says, I think this is more important than that, or I think this is more impactful than that. You can use importance or impact. You can use any dimensions that you want. And then feasibility is, how easy is this to do? Meaning, we have everything we need on the team to do this. We have all the authorization, we have all the capabilities, we have all the information. We've done it before, for instance. It's highly feasible. Or, it depends on another team. Or, we'd have to get approval from an executive to do this. It's like highly infeasible. So that's kind of feeding into our roadmap that we plot across multiple time horizons. So we have now, next, later, and they actually correlate to these kind of like radiuses on the plot. So everything in the top right corner, which is our most impactful, most feasible stuff, we'll do it now, right? We can do it now. It's going to give us the highest payoff in the shortest time. Let's jump on that. And everything else is either lower value or more difficult. We might have to figure some things out first. We might have to build up some momentum and capability. So we plot these things according to now, next, later. Again, according to like capacity. We can't do everything at once. We have to prioritize. We have to basically communicate to everyone else, we're not going to do these things right now. We're going to do these things. We're going to get them done. And then we're going to move on as we have capacity. We can pull these things forward. So we have all these things that we identified. This is like a very simplified list. Sometimes we have 50 things. Sometimes we have 25 things. These are our milestones and actions. These are the things that we're actually going to do. And then we have measures of progress, which I think is really, really underrepresented on most roadmaps. How are we going to know that we're heading in the right direction? How are we going to report on progress? Some of these things are going to take a long time to do. So if we have no measurement, that means you'll get it when you get it, which is nobody likes that answer. If we understand measures of progress, we can report out, but we can also report in. We can understand, are we stalled? Are we making progress on this? Should we expect to see results? And so the other dimension that I think is really important is owners. So having clear definition of ownership so that when we set these things on our roadmap, we understand how are we going to know that this is getting done, that we're making progress, that we can demonstrate some progress. We have a person who's nominated themselves or been nominated by the group, depending on your social dynamics. And they're going to basically be the person who reports on the status, who you can go to if you have questions, who's going to be recruiting support and making sure that this progress is actually happening. And in those later horizons, we don't need to have that like extreme level of detail. We don't need to know our measures of progress yet. Maybe we don't know them. So part of our activity of basically saying that we're ready to work on these later items, they would have to be lined up with measures of progress. They would obviously have owners so that they're ready to work on. Same way that you line up things in a backlog for, to be ready to be pulled by the team. Okay, what would be the takeaway of all of this? I think it's very important to take a step back and really ask the question of what do we want, right? This is our outcome that we're looking for. By doing value stream mapping, we're essentially answering the question, what's in the way? We want to understand why that is true. What are the causes of the conditions that we're seeing in the value stream? So that we can address the causes, not the symptoms of the problem. We want to be imagining and creating a vision of what better looks like, not only because it helps us aim towards something more specific and stay in alignment, but we can also communicate that to leadership and get buy-in, get their confirmation that, yes, that sounds good. You create space for yourself that way, especially when you have a roadmap that says, this is how I'm going to be reporting on progress. This is how you're going to know that things are happening. And this is the plan, right? So we're kind of trying to wrap up an improvement effort into something very clear that has very clear traceability all the way from we have no idea what we're doing to we have a plan and we can clearly communicate it to not only the leadership or anybody who's curious, but the people doing the work can also see what we're doing, how we aim to do it. And I think this builds a muscle of empiricism in the team without demanding that they follow some kind of arbitrary criteria. We do this by doing it, right? We develop this capability by doing the mapping, producing the artifacts. You kind of make this mental connection to like the physical action of mapping things out, and it really creates this reinforcement loop in the brain where all of a sudden these abstract things that were kind of fuzzy and uncomfortable become clearer and more specific. Okay, as I mentioned, you can apply this to any flow of activity in your organization, and I have applied it to all of these different contexts and more. And the same process applies, the same steps, it looks very similar. You have a different map every time. You'll even have a different map in the same team 6 months apart. But that's why we want it to be fast and we want it to be very simple, because we should be doing this type of mapping very often. We have all kinds of mechanisms for continuous improvement. We have dashboards, we have metrics, we have data, but discontinuous improvement, revolutionary change, redesigning things, being ambitious, we don't have a lot of tools for those things, right? And so I see this as an opportunity to kind of support all the data and the dashboards and the tooling that we have with something that allows us to be creative and ambitious. That's kind of the sweet spot for this. So to give you an overview, we have this path from identifying value to enabling flow in the team, in the organization, in the portfolio, whatever the scale is. And we get there by stepping through these incremental mapping exercises where at each stage we're creating an artifact that can be shared, that can be discussed, that can be used as a reference, that kind of makes the intangible more tangible. And hopefully it's simple enough that people don't feel intimidated by this, right? Traditional value stream mapping, there's a bunch of symbols that no one will ever remember. They're really complicated line drawing things with factories and trucks and warehouses and stuff. And I think what we need to take away from that is just a representation of flow that gives us some data that allows for a better conversation about getting things done. Couple of points on AI. I think it's very timely because there's a lot of people investing in areas that are not their bottleneck. They don't necessarily know where their bottlenecks are. They don't necessarily know how to make the case for automation. And I think that this allows for a better conversation about where can we deploy capabilities and have a meaningful impact on what we're really trying to accomplish. I think it really helps with alignment. So there's a lot of not speaking the same language in organizations right now around AI. There's people talking about productivity and efficiency. There's people talking about value and new capabilities. And I think that those conversations can go right past each other if we don't have something specific to talk about. So hopefully this provides an opportunity for that. I do think that we have to be very diligent about experimenting and making time to improve. So hopefully this can justify that in teams. I know a lot of organizations struggle with making time to make time or making time for improvements. I think getting alignment across teams that have different perspectives is really a challenge, especially when we're talking about AI, because sometimes these things are centralized functions and capabilities that people want to use in different ways. And ideally, we're not duplicating efforts or reinventing the wheel 50 times, and we have a unified conversation about what are we all trying to do. In a lot of cases, like I mentioned with the dependencies, you have multiple teams that are struggling with similar things. They might have different opinions, but we can converge those opinions on something clear and actionable, and then there's a much stronger case to implement some specific investment in technology to solve those problems, which can be kind of a collaborative effort rather than these separate point solutions where we're going to do this 5 times and then whoever gets the best result is going to be the standard. Like, there's a lot of very wasteful ways to go about implementing AI. And then ultimately, as we implement all these solutions, we should be able to justify that, yes, that has paid off, right? It's paid off and we should invest further, or it's paid off and that was great, let's move on to something else, or it's not paying off and we need to pivot. So I think being able to understand the data behind this is really important. And that's it. There's a bunch of extra resources if you're interested in more. There's a book and a course for flow engineering. There's a bunch of talks on YouTube, and more context in different places. I think at that QR code for the book, there's also downloadable resources like PDFs of a quick start guide, and there's a game version of flow engineering, which is actually the best way to start out with it. And I'm around. I'd love to talk to anyone who's interested in this area, the problems and the approach. Thanks for coming out.